She can't even keep work." My mom turned on me in court. The room fell silent as the Chief Justice said, "8 years on the bench." Her face went pale. It wasn't the kind of pale that comes from surprise. It was the chalk white of a foundation collapsing, of a truth she'd spent a lifetime burying being excavated under the harshest public light. The rage in her eyes flickered, then died, leaving behind the flat gray ash of humiliation. For a single suspended moment, the air in the Honorable Franklin H. Wallace courtroom was so still you could hear the dust settle. Every eye was on her. The bailiff's hand hovered over his side. The court reporter's fingers froze over her keys. And me? I felt nothing. Not pride, not victory, not the hot, satisfying rush of vindication I had spent my entire youth praying for. Just silence. A profound, echoing quiet in my own head, the kind of absolute peace that follows a shelling. The war was over, and I hadn't fired the final shot. The Chief Justice, a man whose opinions could shape the laws of the entire state, sat back down. The gentle rustle of his black robes was the loudest sound in the world. He had delivered his verdict with the simple weight of a fact. He didn't know he'd just dismantled 15 years of my mother's narrative with 5 simple words. He didn't know about the day it all started. Her face, crumbling under the weight of his authority, dissolved in my mind. The dark wood paneling of the court bled away into cheap government-issue beige. The scent of old paper and floor wax vanished, replaced by stale coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights. I was 22 again, sitting in a chair so stiff it felt like a judgment in itself. Across the desk, a Marine staff sergeant with a jawline that could cut glass slid a stack of papers toward me. His uniform was immaculate, a universe of discipline contained in pressed fabric and polished brass. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He was selling a way out, and he knew I was buying. My mother's voice was still ringing in my ears from the phone call an hour before. It wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was a sigh of weary disappointment, the sound she'd perfected my entire life. Another bright idea, huh? First the law school thing, now this? When are you going to pick a path you can actually finish? Her words weren't an attack. They were a weather forecast. She spoke of my failure as an inevitability, like rain on a weekend. It was the casual cruelty of it that finally broke something in me. I looked at the motivational posters on the wall. An eagle soaring, a platoon cresting a hill. They were cliches, but right then, they felt like scripture. They promised a world built on merit, where your worth was measured by what you could endure, not by who you were born to. A world where my mother wasn't the judge. The staff sergeant tapped a line on the top form with a clean, blunt fingernail. You'll sign here, here, and initial here. This is your commitment to the United States Marine Corps officer candidate, school, with a contract for the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Judge Advocate. It sounded like a contradiction. A warrior and a scholar. A weapon and a scale of justice. It felt right. It felt like me. My hands weren't shaking. I remember that with perfect clarity. For the first time in my life, faced with a decision that would change everything, they were perfectly still. I picked up the pen. It was a cheap government pen, the kind that always leaks in your pocket, but it felt as heavy as a gavel. Her voice was in my head again, a whisper of poison. You can't stick with anything. The pen touched the paper. The ink was black and absolute. I signed my name, the one she gave me, and in doing so, I signed it away. I was forging a new title, one she could never touch, never belittle, and never ever take away. The ink began to dry. It was the first order I ever gave myself that I knew, without a doubt, I would obey. The last thing my mother said to me as I stood by the bus was, "You'll be back in a month." She didn't hug me. She just looked at my bag, then at my face, with the same expression she'd use for a piece of furniture she was about to throw out. It was a statement of fact, not a prediction. That first month, her voice was a constant companion. It was there in the pre-dawn chill of formation, as the Virginia air bit at my skin. It was there when my muscles screamed on the obstacle course, my hands raw and bleeding on the splintered wood. And it was there in the eyes of Officer Candidate Jensen. He was built like a monument to a forgotten war, with a family tree full of generals and commandants. He moved with an easy, inherited arrogance, and when he looked at me, he didn't see a fellow candidate. He saw a civilian in a borrowed uniform, a lawyer playing soldier, a paper pusher. He once saw me struggling to disassemble my rifle and smirked. "Don't worry, ma'am. They don't make you clean these things in a courtroom. You can just quit. He didn't know he was using my mother's language. Or maybe he did. The physical world was a special kind of hell. I wasn't weak, but I wasn't strong like them. Every PFT was a battle for survival. Every forced march a pilgrimage of pain. Sleep wasn't rest. It was just a pause in the ache. But then, we'd enter the classroom, and the world would shift. Our instructor was Major Cole, a man who had prosecuted insurgents in Fallujah and defended Marines in courts-martial. He spoke about the Uniform Code of Military Justice not as a book of rules, but as a living weapon. He saw the law as a force, like gravity or fire, that had to be respected and wielded with lethal precision. While Jensen and the others were memorizing clauses, I was seeing the architecture, the intricate logic. Here, the rules didn't change based on someone's mood. They were absolute. In the chaos of my past, I had craved that kind of order. Here, I finally found it. I devoured the UCMJ, finding a strange comfort in its unyielding structure. The final test was the field training exercise. 72 hours of mud, rain, and simulated combat. By the third night, we were ghosts, running on cold MREs and pure adrenaline. Sleep deprivation was a physical weight on our shoulders. Then, at 0300, the radio crackled to life. A simulated scenario. A civilian vehicle, approaching a checkpoint at high speed, ignoring warnings to halt. Jensen, the acting platoon leader, immediately started shouting orders. Light it up. Set a perimeter. Prepare to engage. His voice was loud, full of command presence. But it was the wrong call. I keyed my mic. My voice was quiet, almost a whisper against the static. Hold. Every head in the command tent turned to me. Jensen shot me a look of pure venom. I kept my eyes on the map. What are the current rules of engagement for this sector, Candidate Jensen? He stammered. The standard row. Which are... I pressed, my voice flat. Positive identification of hostile act or hostile intent is required. A speeding vehicle is not a hostile act, it's a variable. We have a dozen escalation of force procedures to exhaust before we even consider warning shots. I laid out the next 3 steps, calmly, precisely, referencing the specific articles we'd been taught. There was silence. Then the radio crackled again. It was Major Cole who'd been monitoring the channel. Do what she said. The next day during the after-action review, we stood in a wet, exhausted line. Major Cole paced before us, dissecting every failure. He stopped in front of Jensen and made him explain his near-catastrophic mistake for 5 agonizing minutes. Then, he turned and walked to me. He didn't smile. He just looked at me, his eyes taking a measure I hadn't known I was capable of passing. In a firefight, he said, his voice carrying across the field, panic is a contagion. The only antidote is clarity under fire. He gave me a single, sharp nod. And then he moved on. It wasn't praise. It was a statement of fact. And it was the first time in my life a man like that had told me who I was. In the mud and the rain, my mother's voice finally went silent. Clarity under fire. It's a fine principle in a training exercise. On my first deployment, fire was just the baseline state of existence. Forward Operating Base Stryker wasn't a place on a map, it was a condition. A perpetual haze of dust that tasted of metal, the constant thrum of generators and the distant reassuring slam of outgoing artillery. Justice, back home, lived in marble halls. Here it lived in a plywood box between the motor pool and the burn pits, and it smelled of diesel fuel. As the new trial counsel, I was an antibody in the bloodstream of a brigade combat team, necessary but foreign. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, made that clear from day one. He was a man carved from the same rock as the mountains around us, and his stare could strip paint. He called me captain, but his tone said liability. To a man who solved problems with maneuver warfare, a lawyer in his foxhole was just another problem. Then he gave me Specialist Miller. Miller was 19, with a face that hadn't decided to be a man's yet. He was accused of improper escalation of force at a traffic checkpoint. A local national had been injured, the report was clean, and command wanted it handled. Quietly and quickly. It was an open and shut case of a scared kid making a bad call. Except when I looked at Miller, I didn't see a criminal. I saw a trigger puller who was still shaking. The prosecution laid out a simple, damning timeline. But simple things get complicated in the dust. I spent the next 4 days living in my plywood office, fueled by rippets and the hum of the single bare bulb over my desk. I wasn't just reading case law, I was doing the work. I pulled every S2 intelligence summary for the 2 weeks leading up to the incident. I cross-referenced every convoy log from Miller's unit, tracing routes and radio call signs. I sat with the mechanics in the motor pool, going over the maintenance records for his vehicle, learning its blind spots. The infantry guys watched me, this clean officer from another world, digging through their greasy paperwork. At first, they were suspicious. Then, they started helping. The Article 32 hearing was held in the briefing tent. No robes, no jury box. Just folding chairs on a gravel floor. LTC Hayes sat in the back, observing, his arms crossed. His presence filled the entire space. The prosecution presented its case in 20 minutes. It was clean. It was logical. It was wrong. Then it was my turn. I didn't raise my voice. I simply laid out the facts. I put up a map. At 1,400 hours, 2 days before the incident, an S2 brief, which I held up, warned of a new enemy tactic using blue, non-military style pickup trucks for hit-and-run attacks. I then produced the convoy logs. At the time of the incident, Specialist Miller's fire team was at the end of a 72-hour patrol. His sector had been probed 3 times that morning. He was exhausted, yes, but he was also alert. Then came the key piece. A single line from a radio transcript, buried on page 11 of the after-action report. Miller's voice, 30 seconds before the shooting, blue pickup, matching threat description. "Sir, I have positive intent." He hadn't panicked. He had followed intelligence. He had done his job. I didn't look at the investigating officer. I looked at LTC Hayes. For the first time, he was leaning forward, his arms uncrossed. He wasn't watching a lawyer. He was watching a battlefield analysis. He was seeing clarity emerge from the chaos. The recommendation came back an hour later. All charges dismissed. Specialist Miller looked at me, his eyes wet with a relief so profound it was almost painful to watch. I just gave him a nod. Later that evening, as I was leaving the command tent, Hayes stepped out of the shadows. He stood in front of me, blocking my path. I prepared for a lecture. Instead, he just looked at me. "Captain," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "My battle staff meeting is at 0600. Your brief on detainee operations is the first item on the agenda." He paused, holding my gaze. "Don't be late." He walked away without another word. It wasn't praise. It wasn't an apology. It was an order. And it was the first time he'd ever invited me into his war. That tour in the dust changed my internal topography. I came home with a different kind of silence in me, a quiet confidence that had been earned at 0600 staff meetings and in dusty plywood courtrooms. I had been tested against a real adversary. Now, I had to face the one I had left behind. My career began to accelerate. The promotion to captain was followed by a ceremony where they pinned on the Bronze Star. The citation spoke of meritorious achievement in a combat zone, of the Specialist Miller case. It was a heavy weight in my palm. I took a picture of it, resting on the citation, and sent it to my mother. Her reply 3 hours later was a single word. "Nice." I kept the medal in a drawer for 3 years. Next came the promotion to major. The silver bars on my collar were replaced with gold oak leaves. I was no longer a company-grade officer, I was field-grade. My new rank carried a new kind of gravity. I called her to tell her. She listened, then said, "That's good, honey. So, are you seeing anyone special?" The subject was changed with the effortless ease of someone swatting away a fly. The Corps then gave me one of the highest honors a JAG can receive. I was selected for an instructor position at the Legal Center and School in Charlottesville. I was going back to the place that forged me, but now I was the one standing at the lectern. I was Major Cole for a new generation of nervous candidates. My professional world was a meritocracy. My performance reports were flawless. The respect I received from my peers and my superiors was a tangible thing. Every step forward was into a world my mother refused to see. I had built a family bonded by shared hardship and mutual respect. But every phone call home felt like trying to explain the color blue to a person who only saw in shades of gray. After a few years of teaching, I made the decision to transition from active duty to the reserves. It wasn't an ending, it was a pivot. I started a small civilian practice, focusing on military law. I was good at it. The practice grew. One success built on another, and soon, a new path emerged. A local judge was retiring. People I respected, mentors, colleagues, even a few former adversaries, encouraged me to apply. So I did. The vetting process was exhaustive. They interviewed everyone I'd ever served with, read every report I'd ever written. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, I got the call from the governor's office. I had been appointed. My hands were steady as I hung up the phone. I sat in my office, the quiet hum of my computer the only sound, and I felt the weight of it all settle. Judge, the Honorable, a title earned over 15 years of relentless forward movement. And still, a small, stupid part of me, a part I thought had died in the desert, needed to make one last call. I dialed her number. I told her everything. I explained the title, the honor, the black robe I would wear. I told her this was it, the culmination of my entire career, both in and out of uniform. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a void of static and unspoken things. I waited. Then her voice, flat and tired. "Well, I hope this one sticks." She paused, and then delivered the final quiet detonation. It's just so hard to build a real life when you're always jumping from one thing to the next. And just like that, the door closed. There was no bang, no argument, just a quiet, clean click inside my own chest. The hope I'd carried for so long, the foolish belief that one day she would finally see me, it didn't shatter. It simply ceased to exist. I realized she wasn't looking at a career. She was looking at a series of departures, and she saw every one of them as a personal rejection. "Okay, Mom," I said, my voice even. "I have to go." I hung up the phone. I was no longer angry. I was no longer hurt. I was free. The case was closed. Her opinion was no longer admissible evidence in the courtroom of my own self-worth. The air in the courtroom became a solid thing. It was thick with the silence that follows an explosion, where the only sound is the ringing in your own ears. Every person in that room, from the opposing counsel to the stenographer, was frozen. They were all looking at my mother. Her face, which had been a mask of righteous indignation, was now just a face. The anger was gone, the certainty was gone, and in their place was a vast blank confusion. The world as she knew it had just been publicly, irrefutably contradicted by a man whose authority was absolute. It was like watching someone realize the map they'd been using their whole life was of the wrong country. The Chief Justice sat down, the quiet rustle of his robes the only movement. He adjusted his papers, the matter already forgotten. To him, he had simply corrected a factual error. He hadn't detonated a family. I looked at my mother, and the strangest thing happened. I felt the last residue of a 15-year-old rage finally evaporate. It left nothing behind. No triumph, no satisfaction, not even pity. It was the quiet neutrality you feel when a long, grueling case is finally over. All that discipline I had learned. The ability to stay perfectly still while chaos erupted around me, the skill of detaching my emotions to find the core of a problem. It all served me in that moment. I didn't move a muscle. My hands rested calmly on the dark wood of the bench. I was trained for this kind of fire, after all. The quiet, internal kind. I had spent so many years thinking this moment would be a victory, a final, glorious battle where my truth would conquer hers. But sitting there, under the weight of my own robes, I realized the verdict on my life had been rendered years ago. It was rendered in the mud of Quantico, with a quiet nod from Major Cole. It was rendered in the dust of a fob, when a battalion commander gave me an order instead of an excuse. It was rendered every time a young Marine or soldier put their future in my hands and trusted me to see them clearly. It was rendered the day I took my own oath, the day my title became the Honorable. This was just a postscript. An echo in a courtroom that no longer held any jurisdiction over me. My mother's opinion had become hearsay, inadmissible and irrelevant to the facts of my life. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a monster but a deeply unhappy woman who had built her identity on a story that had just been proven false. She needed me to be a failure, because my success was a judgment on her own life. And in that moment of pure, cold clarity, I finally understood. She wasn't my judge, and I was no longer her jury. The gavel fell. The probate hearing was concluded. Court was adjourned. People began to gather their papers, their whispers filling the void. My mother stood, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, and walked out without ever meeting my eyes. Later, I stood in my chambers. The city skyline spread out before me beyond the large window. The noise of the traffic below was a distant hum. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was full. It was peace. The war was over, not because I had won, but because I had finally refused to fight. My mother tried to write my story with one single bitter sentence. The Chief Justice gave me the ending. If anyone has ever tried to define you or write you out of your own story, tell me in the comments how you picked up the pen and wrote your own ending.